The cognitive decline of the digital human. The notification arrived at 3:47 a.m. She didn't remember reaching for her phone, but the blue light was already painting her ceiling in electric hues. Sleep dissolved into scrolling, a muscle memory older than intention. This wasn't insomnia. This was something else entirely. He sat in the meeting, nodding at intervals that felt appropriate. His colleague was explaining something critical: budget projections, strategic pivots, the future of their division. But beneath his focused expression, a different truth pulsed. He couldn't remember a single sentence from 3 minutes ago. The words had entered. They simply hadn't arrived. When was the last time you read something and actually remembered it the next day? Not the feeling of having read it, not the vague shape of the argument, the actual content held in your mind like a tool you could use. Neuroscientists at Stanford began noticing something unsettling in their data around 2019. Attention spans weren't just shortening, they were fragmenting. Subjects could focus, but their focus had changed texture. It had become liquid, spreading thin across surfaces instead of penetrating deep. The digital human wasn't losing intelligence, they were losing depth. She tried an experiment, reading a book for 30 minutes without interruption. No phone, no notifications, no secondary screens humming in peripheral vision. Just text and consciousness, the ancient contract between writer and reader. 15 minutes in, her hands began searching for the phantom weight of her device. Her mind conjured urgent tasks that suddenly required immediate attention. A physical restlessness bloomed in her chest, not anxiety exactly, but something close, withdrawal masquerading as productivity. The book remained open, but she was no longer inside it. Part of him wondered if this was simply evolution. Maybe the human mind was adapting to information abundance, trading depth for breadth, contemplation for rapid pattern recognition. Maybe this was progress wearing an unfamiliar face. But adaptation implies survival advantage, and he was starting to suspect something different was happening. He closed his laptop, not to quit but to observe what happened next. The silence felt loud, accusatory. His thoughts, freed from their usual scaffolding of tabs and feeds, didn't organize into clarity. They scattered like startled birds, each one demanding attention, none willing to land long enough to be examined. This was the architecture of modern cognition, a mind built for interruption, optimized for surfaces, fluent in fragments. In stillness, the noise inside him became readable. Research from the University of California revealed something profound about how we process information in the digital age. When we know we can access data externally through search engines, cloud storage, our devices, our brains don't encode it the same way. We remember where information lives, but not the information itself. We've outsourced memory. And memory, it turns out, wasn't just storage. It was the foundation of thought. She started noticing the pattern everywhere. Conversations where people spoke in links and references instead of arguments. Meetings that felt like collective amnesia. Everyone vaguely recalling they'd discussed something similar last month, but unable to reconstruct what was decided or why. The organization wasn't getting less intelligent. It was losing institutional depth, the ability to build knowledge on top of knowledge, to reference past thinking without having to rediscover it. They were thinking in drafts that never quite solidified into documents. But what troubled her more was the emotional landscape beneath the cognitive shift. Reading used to feel like traveling, each book a journey into someone else's sustained thought, their way of seeing transformed into architecture you could walk through. Now reading felt like surveillance, her eyes moving across words while her attention waited elsewhere, monitoring for the next ping, the next pull, the next small emergency that would justify abandoning this sentence. She wasn't reading anymore. She was guarding against depth. When was the last time you were truly bored? Not uncomfortable or restless, but settled into emptiness. Your mind free to wander without destination, to follow curiosity instead of algorithm. He tried to remember. The attempt itself felt like scrolling through corrupted files, impressions without detail, time markers without content. His memory had become a feed, infinite scroll with no bottom. nothing quite sticky enough to constitute an actual past. This is what concerned the neuroscientists most, not the multitasking or the distraction. The brain had always been distractible. What concerned them was the erosion of autobiographical memory, the sense of a continuous self moving through time with accumulated wisdom. The digital human was becoming present tense, perpetually now, without the gravity of then. Maybe efficiency had become another form of escape, a way to move fast enough that depth couldn't catch up, couldn't ask its uncomfortable questions about meaning and direction, and whether all this motion was taking you anywhere you actually wanted to go. He opened his notes app. 347 notes, each one a fragment of intention. Research for article. Business idea. Thing to remember. None of them elaborated, none of them completed. Just artifacts of thoughts that had seemed important in the moment they arrived and were immediately superseded by the next arrival. His mind had become a staging area for thinking that never quite began. She found a paper from 2023, MIT researchers tracking how medical residents absorbed information in different formats. The ones who learned from physical textbooks, with natural friction and page-turning and the inability to instantly search, retained more and could apply knowledge more flexibly than those who used digital equivalents. The friction wasn't a bug. It was how memory formed. Struggle, it turned out, was the price of permanence. But who has time for struggle when efficiency is the metric and speed is the virtue? Part of her wondered if slowing down meant giving up, if resistance to digital acceleration was just nostalgia wearing intellectual costume, the stubborn refusal to adapt to a world that had already moved on. Then she noticed something else in the data. The physicians who retained depth weren't less productive. They made better decisions faster because they didn't need to look everything up. Their knowledge was integrated, accessible, alive in their thinking rather than stored in devices they consulted. Depth wasn't the opposite of efficiency. It was efficiency's foundation. He started small. 1 hour each morning before opening any screen, just a notebook and whatever thought arrived first. No structure, no purpose, just the practice of following one idea long enough to see where it actually led. The first week felt like learning to walk again. His thoughts kept reaching for hyperlinks, wanting to branch and reference and defer to external authority, wanting to be anywhere but here, in the uncomfortable space of not yet knowing. But gradually something shifted. Ideas that had seemed simple revealed layers. Questions that appeared answered showed hidden assumptions. His thinking developed texture again, not just positions, but the reasoning that led to positions, the doubts that lived alongside certainty. He was becoming three-dimensional again. Researchers in cognitive science talk about desirable difficulties, the productive struggle that forces the brain to encode information more deeply. Handwriting notes instead of typing them, recalling information from memory instead of looking it up, reading physical books that don't let you search for keywords. These aren't romantic gestures toward a pre-digital past. They're how cognition works, how knowledge becomes wisdom, how information transforms into understanding. The brain doesn't want convenience. It wants challenge proportional to importance. She discovered something unexpected during her experiment with sustained reading. Boredom had a threshold. If she stayed with it, didn't reach for distraction the moment attention wavered, something beneath boredom emerged. Not entertainment, not stimulation, curiosity, real curiosity, the kind that asks questions without immediate answers, that wonders about implications and connections, that wants to understand rather than simply know. This was what the algorithm couldn't replicate, the slow-burning interest that develops when you stay with something long enough to see past its surface. Sometimes clarity isn't found, it's allowed. He tried disconnecting for a weekend. No phone, no laptop, no smart devices negotiating his relationship with reality. Just time and thought, and the uncomfortable spaciousness of hours that had to be filled with something other than consumption. The first day felt like punishment. His hands reached for phantom devices. His mind generated elaborate justifications for why this particular message, this specific update, couldn't wait until Monday. But the second day, something unexpected. Time slowed down. Not in the frustrating way, in a way that felt like waking up. Conversations extended because there was nowhere else to be. Thoughts completed because there was nothing to interrupt them. He tried to disconnect and ended up connecting deeper. What surprised him most wasn't the relief. It was the realization of how much energy he'd been spending just managing the digital load. The constant triage of notifications, the perpetual decision of what deserved attention, the mental overhead of maintaining presence across a dozen platforms while being fully present in none. He wasn't tired of work. He was tired of maintenance masquerading as work. Neuroscientists studying attention describe two distinct networks in the brain: the task-positive network, activated during focused work, and the default mode network, active during rest and mind-wandering. Both are essential. But in the digital age, neither gets what it needs. We're never quite focused because distraction is always one swipe away. And we're never quite resting because our rest is filled with content consumption, our downtime colonized by feeds. We've created a cognitive environment with no off switch. And the brain, starved of both deep focus and genuine rest, begins to degrade in subtle but cumulative ways. She noticed it first in her students. Brilliant minds, all of them, but when asked to sustain an argument for more than 2 minutes, to follow a thread of logic without branching into tangents, to consider a question without immediately searching for answers, they struggled. Not because they lacked intelligence, because they lacked practice in the architecture of sustained thought. They could process information at remarkable speed, but processing isn't thinking, and speed isn't understanding. The digital human had become extraordinarily good at finding information and remarkably poor at knowing what to do with it once found. He started asking different questions in meetings. Not, what does the data say, but what does the data mean? Not, what are our options, but what are we optimizing for and why? The conversations changed texture, slowed down. People had to think instead of reference, to construct arguments instead of citing sources, to acknowledge uncertainty instead of deferring to metrics. The meetings took longer, but the decisions got better. In stillness, what had seemed like signal revealed itself as noise, and what had seemed like noise are the quiet intuitions, the half-formed doubts, the questions that didn't have immediate answers, emerged as the actual signal. What's fascinating about cognitive decline in the digital age is that it's invisible to the people experiencing it. We feel busy, productive, informed. Our devices confirm our efficiency with metrics and dashboards and quantified self-satisfaction. But efficiency at what? Productivity toward what end? Somewhere along the way, we stopped asking whether the speed was taking us anywhere worth going. She found herself thinking about her grandmother, who could recite poetry memorized in childhood, who knew recipes without consulting notes, who held entire family genealogies in her mind like a living archive. Not because she was exceptional, because that's what memory did when it had to do the work itself. What would her generation leave behind? 1 million digital artifacts scattered across defunct platforms, behind expired passwords, in formats future systems couldn't read. They were creating abundance, but abundance isn't the same as legacy. Part of him resisted the obvious conclusion that digital tools were making us cognitively worse, because the tools themselves weren't the problem. They were mirrors, reflecting our choices back with perfect fidelity. The real question was harder. What kind of minds did we want to build? What kind of thinking did we want to be capable of? What depth of understanding did we consider worth the cost of its cultivation? These weren't technical questions. They were questions about what it meant to be human in an age that made humanity optional. He chose depth, not as rejection of technology, but as insistence on using it deliberately. Tools serving thought instead of replacing it. The cursor still blinked on the screen, but he had learned to recognize what it was actually asking. Not for content, but for consideration. Not for speed, but for substance. Not for the next thing, but for the right thing. What surprised me most wasn't how an analog journal improved my workflow, but how it redefined what productivity meant to me. I wasn't expecting a tool to change my rhythm of thought, and honestly, I tested it more than once before I understood what actually mattered. This isn't a recommendation, just a reflection that stayed with me. I'll leave the link below if you feel called to explore what I mean. She kept the journal by her bed now, not for productivity, not for optimization, just for the practice of thought that didn't need to go anywhere, that existed for its own sake, that reminded her that her mind was capable of more than reaction. Some mornings she wrote. Some mornings she stared at blank pages and let thoughts arrange themselves without transcription. Both were valuable. Both were forms of depth the digital couldn't replicate. Slowly, quietly, her mind was learning to be itself again. The research keeps accumulating. We're in the early stages of understanding what constant digital engagement does to human cognition over decades. But the preliminary findings point in a consistent direction, not toward catastrophe but toward diminishment, a gradual erosion of capacities we didn't realize were fragile until we stopped exercising them. Memory, attention, contemplation, solitude, boredom, patience, depth, not luxuries, foundations. He still used his devices, still engaged with digital tools, still participated in the accelerated world that demanded constant connectivity. But he did so differently now, with intervals of disconnection, with boundaries around attention, with practices that protected the cognitive capacities that made everything else possible. The digital human didn't have to be diminished, but becoming more required, becoming deliberate. The choice wasn't between technology and humanity, it was between drift and direction, between letting tools shape us unconsciously or choosing what kind of minds we wanted to build. The cursor blinked, but now it wasn't asking for words. It was waiting for presence. What part of this reflection spoke to you most? And from where are you watching? Let's keep the dialogue open, quietly. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.